The road stretched endlessly before Michael, a narrow strip of asphalt cutting through the vast, empty countryside. Trees, dark and dense, lined the horizon, and the sky above had begun to churn with thick, ominous clouds. He glanced at the fuel gauge. Nearly full. His car, however, had other plans. The engine sputtered once, twice, then died completely, leaving the vehicle to coast silently along the road before coming to a complete stop. "Great," Michael muttered, slapping the steering wheel in frustration. He turned the key in the ignition again, but all he got was a hollow mechanical whine. The car was dead, and now he was stranded in the middle of nowhere. He pulled out his phone, hoping for a miracle, but the signal bars were absent. He tried again, holding it up higher, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. No service. Of course, he thought bitterly, as if this night couldn't get any worse. Outside, the first few drops of rain spattered against the windshield, quickly followed by more as the sky seemed to split open, unleashing a torrential downpour. Water streaked down the glass in sheets, and thunder rumbled in the distance, low and menacing. It had looked abandoned, with its sagging roof and broken windows, but at least it was shelter from the rain. He didn't have much choice. With a resigned sigh, Michael zipped up his jacket, grabbed his phone and keys, and pushed open the car door. The rain was instantly relentless, soaking through his clothes in seconds. He pulled his jacket over his head and sprinted down the road, the wind whipping the rain sideways into his face. As he approached the house, it loomed in the distance, a hulking silhouette against the darkened sky. Its structure was dilapidated, as if time had forgotten it. The windows were shattered, the paint peeling away in long strips. The porch creaked ominously under his feet as he climbed the stairs and stood before the front door, which hung slightly ajar. Michael hesitated, glancing back toward the road. The rain was coming down in sheets now, a wall of water that made it impossible to see anything beyond the trees. He didn't want to be out there any longer. He pushed the door open, wincing as it groaned loudly in protest, and stepped inside. The interior of the house was even more neglected than the exterior. The floorboards beneath his feet were warped and creaky, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust clung to every surface, undisturbed for what seemed like decades. Cobwebs hung in the corners like forgotten decorations, and the walls were cracked and peeling. But at least it was dry. Michael stood in the entryway, dripping onto the faded carpet as he glanced around. There was a staircase leading to the second floor, but most of the doors on the ground level were closed. He pulled out his phone again, just to check, but there was still no signal. No surprise there. "Wow, this is better than sitting in the rain," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. He took a few cautious steps into the house, the wooden floor groaning under his weight. The deeper he ventured inside, the more unsettling it felt. The rain drummed loudly on the roof, but inside it was deathly silent. Too silent. Michael's footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, echoing in the stillness. He glanced up the staircase, noting how the shadows clung to the upper landing, thick and unmoving. Something about it made his stomach twist with discomfort, but he quickly dismissed it as his imagination running wild. It was just an old house. Abandoned, sure, but harmless. He found a room that seemed relatively dry and tucked himself into a corner, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. He pulled his jacket tighter, trying to shake off the cold that was settling into his bones. For a moment, he considered going back out to the car, but the rain showed no signs of letting up. Michael sighed, leaning his head back against the wall. "Just a few hours until morning," he whispered to himself, trying to find some comfort in the thought. But as he closed his eyes and tried to relax, a sound broke through the silence. A soft, distant creak from somewhere upstairs. Michael's eyes snapped open, his heart leaping into his throat. He listened, holding his breath, but there was only silence now. Maybe it was just the house settling, he thought, but the uneasy feeling crept back in stronger than before. He sat up straighter, his muscles tense. Then there it was again. A creak, louder this time, as if someone was walking around on the second floor. Footsteps. His heart raced, and he stared at the ceiling, trying to track the sound. It moved slowly, steadily, like someone pacing back and forth, just out of sight. Michael swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He wasn't alone. The sound of footsteps echoed through the empty house, growing louder and more distinct with each passing second. Michael sat frozen, his back pressed against the cold, damp wall. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. The steady creak of floorboards overhead was unmistakable. Someone or something was upstairs. Hello? He called out, his voice trembling in the silence. No answer. The rain continued to hammer against the windows, the wind howling outside, but inside the house, it felt unnaturally quiet again. The footsteps had stopped as abruptly as they had started. Michael strained his ears, listening, but all he could hear was the dull thud of his own heartbeat in his chest. For a moment, he thought about leaving, running back to the car and waiting out the storm, no matter how bad it got. But when he glanced outside through the broken window, all he saw was darkness and rain, thick sheets of water cascading down like a curtain. The idea of stepping back out into that tempest made his stomach turn. He shook his head, trying to calm himself. It's just an old house, he muttered, half to himself. It's probably creaking because of the storm, or maybe it's an animal. Yeah, that's it. Some raccoon or something. But the thought did little to ease the growing knot of anxiety in his chest. He pulled his phone from his pocket, hoping for a miracle, a signal, a missed call, anything. The screen illuminated his face in the dimly lit room, casting long shadows on the walls, but the signal bars were still empty. He had no way to reach out for help. With no other option, he tapped the flashlight icon on his phone. A narrow beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the decaying interior of the house in greater detail. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by his movement, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the room. The walls were covered in peeling, yellowed wallpaper, stained with age and neglect. Michael stood, the floor creaking beneath his weight, and cautiously made his way back to the entryway. Maybe someone else really was here. Another stranded traveler seeking shelter from the storm. He tried to convince himself that was all it was, but the unease gnawing at his gut refused to let go. He moved toward the base of the staircase, the dim beam of his phone's light trembling as his hand shook slightly. Hello? He called again, more hesitant this time. Is anyone here? Nothing. His breath caught in his throat as the silence stretched on. His gaze moved up the staircase, tracing the wooden banister to the second floor, where the shadows seemed even darker, heavier. The hair on the back of his neck prickled with unease, and he fought the urge to turn around and leave right then. But curiosity and a strange, irrational hope that someone else was in the house kept him moving. He started climbing the stairs, each step groaning under his weight. The air grew colder the higher he went, and a damp, musty smell filled his nostrils. His heart thudded louder in his chest with every step. When he reached the top, his phone's light revealed a long, narrow hallway stretching out before him. The floor was covered in old, threadbare carpet, stained with water damage and age. Doors lined the hall on both sides, most of them closed, their paint peeling away in chunks. At the far end of the hallway, a large window was cracked, letting in a slight draft that stirred the air around him. Michael hesitated, unsure of which door to try first. The footsteps had seemed to come from somewhere up here, but now the house was as silent as a tomb. He decided to check the first door on his left. Reaching out, he grasped a cold brass knob, twisting it slowly. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a small, empty bedroom. The walls were bare, and the only furniture was a dilapidated bed frame, its mattress long gone. Nothing, just an empty room. He exhaled a shaky breath, moving on to the next door. This one led to what appeared to be a study, though like the rest of the house, it was in a state of decay. An old, dust-covered desk sat in the corner, its surface cluttered with papers, yellowed from time. He didn't dare touch anything. It felt wrong, as if disturbing the remnants of the past would bring something terrible into the present. As he stepped back into the hallway, a new sound reached his ears, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. Crying. Michael froze, his blood running cold. It was unmistakable. Soft, childlike sobs coming from somewhere further down the hall. He turned his head slowly, shining his flashlight down the dark corridor. The crying seemed to be coming from the far end, near the cracked window. His throat tightened. This was no raccoon. No animal could make that sound, and no rational explanation could shake the icy fear crawling up his spine. But despite every instinct screaming at him to leave, to get out of the house, he took a step toward the sound. The crying grew louder as he approached, the sobs echoing off the walls, bouncing back at him in the cold, empty air. His pulse pounded in his ears, and sweat broke out on his forehead, despite the chill. As he reached the last door at the end of the hallway, the sobbing stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. His fingers hovered over the doorknob, his body trembling as he struggled to decide whether to open it. He wasn't sure he wanted to see what was on the other side. The air was thick with something, an oppressive, malevolent presence that pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. But before he could make a decision, the door creaked open on its own. Michael stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. His flashlight flickered as he shined it into the room beyond. It was empty, just like the others. The room was bare, with nothing but the crumbling remnants of a life long gone. But the crying had been so close, too close. His mind reeled as he stood frozen in the doorway, fear coiling tighter around his chest. Something was wrong with this house, very wrong. And Michael had no idea how deep the nightmare would go. Michael stood at the threshold of the empty room, his breath catching in his throat. His phone's flashlight flickered weakly, as if the light itself was afraid to pierce the darkness any further. The oppressive silence weighed on him, more suffocating than the musty air. The crying, so close, so real, had vanished the moment the door opened. But the feeling of being watched lingered, pressing in on him like a cold, invisible hand. He backed away slowly, his mind racing. This was no simple shelter from the rain. Something was wrong with this place. The hallway felt longer now, and the air seemed heavier, thicker, as if it were trying to force him to stay. He needed to get out of here, but his legs felt like lead as he turned to leave. Suddenly, from somewhere deeper in the house, the crying started again, fainter this time, but more desperate. It echoed down the halls, rising and falling in a rhythmic sob. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine, the hair on his arms standing on end. He wasn't alone. He gripped his phone tighter, the beam of light shaking as his hand trembled. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs moved in the opposite direction, toward the sound. He couldn't help himself. There was something in those cries, something that pulled at him. Whoever or whatever was crying sounded scared, and Michael needed to know why. Step by cautious step, he ventured further into the hallway, his phone lighting the way just enough to see the old, tattered carpet beneath his feet. The crying grew louder as he approached a narrow corridor that seemed to lead deeper into the house. This hallway wasn't like the one upstairs. It was darker, more confined, and the walls seemed to bend inward, like the house was closing in on him. The sound of footsteps echoed once again, this time much clearer. Michael stopped dead in his tracks, shining the light down the corridor. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it. Something, or someone, was down there. The crying shifted, now accompanied by faint whispers. The words were unintelligible, but they sent a jolt of fear through his chest. He took a step back, his eyes scanning the dark corners, expecting to see something dart out at him at any moment. His breath quickened, and his heart hammered so loudly in his ears that he barely heard the next sound, a giggle. A child's soft, innocent laugh echoed in the hallway, and Michael's heart nearly stopped. It was close. Too close. He whipped his flashlight toward the source of the sound, and for a moment, the beam flickered over something small. A figure darting across the hallway. His breath caught in his throat as he caught a glimpse of what looked like a child, no older than 6, running into one of the rooms. The child was barefoot, wearing an old, torn nightgown, her hair flowing as she disappeared around the corner. "Wait!" Michael's voice cracked as he called out, not entirely sure why. He took a few shaky steps toward where the child had gone, but the hallway seemed to stretch impossibly longer with each step. The crying started again, louder this time and more frantic. It seemed to come from all directions, filling the house like a wave of sadness and fear that washed over him, threatening to drown him in its intensity. As he reached the corner where the child had disappeared, he hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to turn around and run as fast as he could. But curiosity, or maybe something darker, pushed him forward. He rounded the corner, shining his light into the room beyond. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the crying stopped again, leaving the air unnervingly still. The room before him was larger than the others, but completely empty. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight as he stepped inside, sweeping the beam of his flashlight over the peeling wallpaper and shattered windows. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. And then he saw them. 3 small figures stood in the far corner of the room, huddled together. The beam of light trembled as it landed on them. 3 children, barely visible in the dim light, their faces obscured by shadows. They stood still, their backs to him, their heads bowed as if they were hiding from something. Michael's stomach twisted into a knot, cold sweat beading on his forehead. He wanted to speak, to call out to them, but his throat felt like it had closed up entirely. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. One of the children turned its head slowly, just enough for Michael to catch a glimpse of its face. A face that wasn't fully there. The skin was pale, almost translucent, with dark hollows where the eyes should have been. The child's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The other 2 children remained still, as if frozen in time. Michael took a step back, his heart slamming against his ribs. He had seen enough. Whatever this was, whatever these children were, it wasn't natural. He turned on his heel and bolted from the room, his pulse racing as he fled down the corridor. But the house seemed to shift around him. The once familiar hallway twisted, turning into a maze of dark, endless corridors. Every turn he made brought him to another identical hallway, the shadows growing darker, the air colder. Panic set in as he realized he couldn't find his way back. The house had changed, and now it was trapping him. His breathing grew ragged, his steps frantic as he ran, the sound of crying and footsteps now following him, surrounding him. His phone's battery drained faster, the light flickering as it struggled to stay on. He turned corner after corner, but every hallway led to more confusion, more darkness. And then, from behind him, he heard it. A soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet. He spun around, his flashlight barely illuminating the hallway, and there, standing in the middle of the corridor, was the little girl he had seen earlier. She was closer now, her face still turned away, but her sobbing had stopped. Her small, frail figure stood completely still, except for the occasional twitch of her shoulders. Michael took a step back, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The girl's head slowly began to turn, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if something was forcing her to look at him. He felt his stomach drop, and without waiting to see her face, he turned and ran. Michael's legs burned as he ran, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. His phone's light flickered weakly, barely enough to cut through the thick darkness surrounding him. He had no idea where he was going anymore. Every hallway looked the same, and every door led him deeper into the house's labyrinth of twisted corridors. It was as though the house itself had come alive, shifting and stretching, trapping him inside its suffocating embrace. The sobbing of the little girl echoed faintly in the distance, sending chills down his spine. No matter how fast he ran, the sound followed him, always just out of sight, always drawing him deeper into the nightmare. His mind raced, trying to piece together what he had seen. The children, those translucent, ghostly figures, weren't just haunting the house. They were reliving something, some horrific event, over and over again. As he rounded yet another corner, Michael stumbled into a large room, gasping for air. His phone's flashlight sputtered one last time before the screen went black, plunging him into complete darkness. No, he muttered, frantically tapping the screen, but the battery was dead. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, the darkness swallowed him whole. He stood frozen in the pitch-black room, the only sound the steady thumping of his pulse in his ears. Then, from somewhere close by, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Light, rapid footsteps like someone running. He turned toward the noise, his eyes straining in the darkness, and that's when he saw them. 3 figures darted past him, barely more than shadows in the faint light seeping through the broken windows. The children. They were running, their small feet thudding against the old wooden floor. They looked terrified, their heads turning frantically as if they were being chased by something unseen. Michael stood frozen, watching the ghostly children race across the room. His throat tightened, and he opened his mouth to call out to them, but no sound came. His body refused to move, rooted to the spot by the sheer terror coursing through his veins. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, the children vanished into the shadows. Their footsteps faded into the distance, leaving Michael alone once more. But the room wasn't empty. A soft sound, barely a whisper, drifted through the darkness, sending a wave of dread crashing over him. He spun around, his pulse quickening as his eyes darted wildly across the room, searching for the source. And then he saw her. A little girl stood in the corner, her back turned to him. She wore a simple white nightgown, stained and torn, and her small frame shook with quiet sobs. Michael felt the cold tendrils of fear coil around his chest as he took a hesitant step back. This girl was different from the others. The air around her felt heavy, oppressive, and the room seemed to grow colder with every passing second. He wanted to leave, to run as fast as he could, but something held him in place. His legs felt like lead, his body refusing to obey the desperate command to flee. The girl's sobbing stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick and unnatural. Michael's mouth went dry as he watched the girl's head slowly turn toward him, her movements jerky and unnatural, as though something was forcing her to move. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound almost deafening in the stillness. When she finally turned to face him, Michael gasped. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were hollow black voids, empty of life. Blood trickled down the side of her face, and her small, trembling hands clutched the stump of her arm where it had been severed. The girl stared at him with those empty eyes, her mouth open as if she was trying to speak, but no words came out. Panic surged through Michael's body, and he stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to get out of here. Now. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty house as he bolted down the nearest hallway. But no matter how fast he ran, the sound of the girl's sobs followed him, growing louder and more desperate with every step. The house seemed to stretch and twist around him, the walls closing in, trapping him in its nightmarish maze. As he rounded a corner, Michael skidded to a halt. Another figure stood in the middle of the hallway. A young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old. His small body was drenched in blood, and one of his arms was missing, the jagged stump trailing gore. The boy's head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his empty eyes stared straight at Michael as if pleading for help. Michael's breath hitched in his throat, and for a moment he couldn't move. The boy stood there, motionless, his hollow gaze fixed on Michael. His lips moved silently, as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. Then, from behind him, Michael heard the sound of running footsteps again. He spun around just in time to see a little girl racing toward him, her face twisted in terror. Her feet barely touched the ground as she sprinted down the corridor, her wide eyes locked on something behind her. Michael's heart hammered in his chest as he turned to look, and his blood ran cold. Chasing the girl was a man. His figure was tall and broad, dressed in an old, tattered coat. His face was contorted with rage, his eyes wild and bloodshot, and in his hand he held a large, rusted knife. The blade gleamed dully in the faint light, streaked with dried blood. The man's footsteps thundered down the hall as he closed in on the girl, his mouth twisted into a snarl. Michael's legs trembled, and he stumbled backward, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He had seen enough. He knew now what he was witnessing. The ghosts of the children and the man were trapped here, forever reliving the horror of that night. The night the man had killed the 3 children before taking his own life. This wasn't just a haunted house. It was a prison, a place where the past never died. The girl's terrified scream pierced the air as the man closed in on her, his knife raised high. Michael couldn't watch anymore. He turned and ran as fast as he could, his pulse pounding in his ears. But no matter how fast he ran, the house seemed to stretch on forever, its hallways winding into a maddening maze. His vision blurred, and his breath came in ragged bursts. He could hear the man's footsteps now, heavy and relentless, growing closer with each passing second. The children's cries echoed around him, mingling with the sound of his own racing heartbeat. Desperate and disoriented, Michael turned a corner and stumbled to a halt. The hallway before him was empty, save for a single door at the far end. Without thinking, he bolted for it, his legs burning with exhaustion. He reached the door, grasping the handle and yanking it open. But what lay beyond wasn't an exit. It was darkness. Michael stared into the dark void beyond the door, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The air was thick, oppressive, pressing down on him like a weight. He felt a chill creep up his spine, his body frozen in place as he tried to make sense of what lay beyond the threshold. It wasn't just darkness. It was an absence, a gaping hole that swallowed everything. And then he felt it, something cold brushing against his skin, like fingers trailing across his arm. He jerked backward, slamming the door shut behind him, his heart hammering in his chest. The house groaned around him, as if alive, as if it could feel his terror. He spun around, ready to run again, but the house wasn't finished with him. From behind, he heard the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, growing louder with each second. Michael's pulse raced as he turned, his eyes searching the corridor. At first, he saw nothing. The air was still, the shadows unnaturally thick. But then, from the corner of his vision, something moved. The little boy stood at the end of the hallway, motionless, his head hanging low. Blood dripped from the stump of his arm, pooling on the floor beneath him. His hollow eyes stared blankly at Michael, his mouth moving as if whispering something too quiet to hear. Michael took a step back, his heart pounding so hard he could barely breathe. He wanted to run, to scream, but his feet wouldn't move. Then, from behind the boy, the shadow shifted. A tall figure emerged, towering over the child. A man, his face contorted in rage, his wild eyes gleaming with madness. His coat flapped as he moved forward, the rusted knife in his hand gleaming faintly in the dim light. Michael's blood turned to ice. The man's hand shot out, grabbing the little boy by the shoulder, his grip tight and unyielding. The boy let out a faint, pitiful cry, his hollow eyes wide with terror. The man raised the knife, his face twisted with a sickening smile, his grip tightening as he pulled the boy closer. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He knew what was going to happen, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The knife plunged down. The boy's scream pierced the air, echoing down the hallway, a sound so full of pain and fear that it sent a jolt of terror through Michael's body. He wanted to run, to get away, but the house seemed to pull him in, forcing him to witness the horror playing out before him. The man's laughter, low and guttural, filled the hallway as he pulled the knife free, blood splattering the walls. The boy's body crumpled to the floor, lifeless, his eyes staring blankly at Michael. And then it was as if time itself had rewound. The boy stood again, the man still behind him, gripping his shoulder. The scene repeated itself, over and over, the boy's death playing out in an endless loop, each time more gruesome than the last, each scream louder and more desperate. Michael couldn't take it anymore. He turned and bolted down the hallway, his legs trembling beneath him. His breath came in ragged bursts as he tried to escape the nightmarish vision, but the house seemed to shift around him, warping and twisting like a living thing. Every turn brought him back to the same hallway, the same scene. He could still hear the boy's screams echoing in his ears, the man's laughter filling the air. He turned another corner, desperate to escape, and found himself in a different room. A small, cramped space that smelled of dust and decay. The walls were lined with old photographs, their frames crooked and covered in grime. Michael stumbled forward, his legs barely holding him up, his mind spinning from the terror. But the photographs caught his attention. He approached them, wiping the dust away with his hand, revealing the faces behind the glass. They were the children, the little boy, the two girls. Their faces were frozen in time, smiling innocently at the camera, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Next to them, a man stood, his hand resting on the shoulder of one of the girls. His face was calm, almost fatherly, but Michael recognized him immediately. It was the man with the knife. Michael staggered back, his stomach churning with fear. This was their house. This was where the murders had taken place. And the man was their father. He was trapped in the house with the ghosts of a family torn apart by madness and murder. The children weren't just victims. They were prisoners, forever reliving the night their father killed them in a fit of rage. And now, Michael was part of their nightmare. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoed through the house again. Michael's blood ran cold as he realized the man was coming for him now. His breath hitched in his throat as he backed away from the photographs, his eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out. But there was none. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air growing thick with dread. And then he saw her, the little girl, standing in the doorway. Her dress was torn, her face pale and bloodied, and her eyes were wide with fear. She stood there, trembling, staring at Michael with an expression of pure terror. But it wasn't him she was afraid of. She was afraid of what was behind her. Michael's heart stopped as the man appeared in the hallway, his knife gleaming in the faint light. He moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes fixed on the girl, his smile growing wider with each step. The girl turned to Michael, her mouth opening a silent plea for help. But Michael couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The man lunged forward, and the girl screamed. The sound was deafening, piercing Michael's ears and filling the room with a wave of pure terror. He stumbled backward, his body trembling, his heart racing so fast he thought it might burst. And then the lights went out. The house was plunged into darkness, the silence so thick it felt like a physical presence. Michael's breath came in ragged gasps as he stood there, waiting, terrified of what would come next. but nothing happened. The man, the girl, the house. They were gone. Michael collapsed to the floor, his body shaking with exhaustion and fear. He couldn't take it anymore. The house had won. He closed his eyes, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. He just wanted it to end. And as he drifted into unconsciousness, the last sound he heard was the faint echo of children's laughter, drifting through the darkness. Michael's eyes fluttered open to darkness. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. His body was heavy, and his breath came in shallow gasps, each one sending a sharp pain through his chest. His limbs felt stiff, like he'd been lying there for hours, but something deeper tugged at him. A sense of terror that began to creep back as his memories returned. The house. The ghosts. The children's screams. He jerked upright, his muscles protesting from the sudden movement. The faint sound of children's laughter still echoed in his ears, a haunting melody that clung to the edges of his mind. He was back in the hallway, the same twisted corridor that had become a living nightmare. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced around, half expecting the bloodied man or the children's ghost to reappear from the shadows. But everything was still, unnervingly quiet. He tried to stand, but his legs wobbled beneath him, barely able to support his weight. Exhaustion tugged at his bones, but fear kept him moving. He had to get out. He couldn't stay here any longer. He stumbled forward, his hands brushing against the cold walls for support as he moved down the hallway. But the house had changed again. The once endless corridors now twisted into a tighter maze, the walls pressing in on him, the ceiling seeming lower. Every turn brought him to the same place, the same dead ends, as though the house itself was alive, bending and shifting to keep him trapped. Come on, he whispered to himself, his voice shaky. His vision swam with exhaustion, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. The floor creaked beneath his feet, the walls groaning as if the house was aware of his every move. A distant cry echoed through the halls. A child's voice, faint and sorrowful. It tugged at his heart, but he had no more strength to follow it. He knew what it was now. The ghosts, trapped here, doomed to relive their deaths over and over again. He wasn't going to let the same fate befall him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled into another room, one he hadn't seen before. The walls were bare, the floor covered in debris, shattered wood, old furniture, and dust. But there was something else. In the corner, leaning against the crumbling wall, was an old, rusted door. Its handle was crooked, and the paint had peeled off in patches, but it looked like an exit. Hope flared in Michael's chest. Could it be? Could this be his way out? He rushed toward it, his hands shaking as he grabbed the handle. He pulled, but the door didn't budge. His heart sank, and he yanked harder, panic rising in his chest. Come on! Please, he cried, his voice echoing off the decaying walls. The door groaned but remained shut. Michael's pulse raced as he pounded his fist against the wood, desperation clawing at him. He wasn't going to die here. He wasn't going to be trapped like those children. But as he struggled with the door, something moved behind him, a soft, shuffling sound. Barely audible, but unmistakable. His blood ran cold as he turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The man was there, standing just a few feet away, his tall figure looming in the shadows. His face was twisted in a grotesque smile, his eyes wild with madness. The rusted knife gleamed in his hand, the blade stained with blood that had long since dried. Michael froze, his back pressed against the door, his body trembling with fear. The man took a step forward, his heavy boots thudding against the creaking floorboards. His grin widened, his eyes locking onto Michael's with an intensity that sent a wave of nausea through him. No, Michael whispered, shaking his head. His hands fumbled for the door handle, but it still wouldn't move. Please, no. The man's footsteps grew louder as he approached, his knife raised high. Michael's breath hitched, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. His throat tightened as the man drew closer, his dark, bloodshot eyes staring into his soul. And then the man lunged. Michael's body reacted on instinct. He threw himself to the side, narrowly avoiding the blade as it came down with a sickening thud, sinking into the door. The force of the strike rattled the rusted frame, splintering the wood. Michael scrambled to his feet, his body shaking with adrenaline. But the man was already pulling the knife free, his eyes burning with fury. Michael backed away, his pulse racing, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The man turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Michael again, his twisted grin returning. "Get away from me!" Michael screamed, his voice cracking with terror. But the man didn't stop. He moved forward again, slowly, deliberately, savoring every second of Michael's fear. With no other option, Michael turned and ran. His legs felt like they were made of lead, but he forced them to move, stumbling down another hallway, the man's footsteps heavy behind him. His vision blurred as exhaustion clawed at him, but the fear kept him running. He rounded a corner, his legs trembling beneath him, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The house twisted and stretched around him, the walls bending like a maze, trapping him in its endless corridors. His head spun, and the walls seemed to close in, squeezing the air from his lungs. The children's cries echoed in his ears, their voices distant and distorted, as if they were calling to him from some far-off place. But he couldn't focus on them. All he could think about was getting away from the man. He could still hear his footsteps, slow and methodical, always behind him, always closing in. But then, something strange happened. The house shifted again, but this time, the hallway in front of him ended in a door. A large wooden door that stood slightly ajar. Pale light spilled out from the crack, casting long shadows on the floor. Michael's heart leaped with hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was his way out. He sprinted toward the door, his legs barely carrying him as he pushed it open. Bright sunlight flooded the room, blinding him for a moment. He stumbled forward, blinking against the light, and found himself standing in what looked like a grand foyer. The decaying walls were gone, replaced with bright, pristine paint. The floor beneath his feet was polished wood, gleaming in the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. But it wasn't the same house. It couldn't be. Michael blinked in confusion, his head spinning. Was this real? Or was the house playing tricks on him again? He took a step forward, his legs trembling beneath him, when suddenly, the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. The noise startled him, and he spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. The door was gone. In its place was a solid wall, as if the door had never existed. And then, everything went black. Michael collapsed to the floor, his body giving out from sheer exhaustion. He couldn't run anymore. His muscles burned, his head throbbed, and his vision swam with dizziness. He gasped for air, his chest heaving with every breath. As he lay there, his eyes fluttered shut, the world around him fading away. The last thing he heard before everything went silent was the faint sound of children's laughter, echoing through the darkness. And then, nothing. Morning came with a soft warmth that felt foreign after the night's terror. Michael awoke to the sensation of damp earth beneath him, the smell of wet grass filling his nostrils. His body was stiff, every muscle sore, as if he had been running for miles. Slowly, he blinked his eyes open, wincing against the bright sunlight filtering through the trees. It took him a moment to realize he was no longer inside the house. He lay on his back, staring up at the wide-open sky. There was no sign of the suffocating walls, the dark corridors, or the twisted shadows that had tormented him throughout the night. Just open space, trees swaying gently in the breeze, and the distant call of birds. For a brief moment, Michael wondered if it had all been a nightmare, a vivid, horrifying nightmare that had played out in his mind while he slept. But as he sat up, groaning with the effort, he saw something that stopped his heart. The house was gone. He stood slowly, his legs shaky and weak, and looked around. The place where the house had stood was nothing but an empty clearing now. The only remnants of the structure were a crumbling foundation, a few scattered bricks, and rotting planks of wood, overgrown with weeds and vines. The place looked as though it had been abandoned for decades, completely reclaimed by nature. Michael's heart raced, his breath coming in short gasps as he struggled to understand what had happened. The house had been there. He had been inside it, running from room to room, trapped in its endless, shifting halls. He had seen the ghosts, felt the terror of the children and the rage of the man with the knife. It couldn't have just disappeared. He took a few hesitant steps forward, his shoes crunching on the debris that littered the ground. There was no sign of the horrors that had unfolded inside those walls. No blood, no torn nightgowns or broken furniture. Just silence and sunlight. Michael swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing, but his mind was racing. How could this be real? How could an entire house vanish, leaving behind only the foundation as if it had never existed? He rubbed his hands over his face, wiping away the cold sweat that clung to his skin. His fingers brushed the stubble on his jawline, the sensation grounding him in the present. But the memories of the night before lingered at the edges of his mind, refusing to fade. As he wandered closer to the remnants of the house, something caught his eye. A small, weathered object sticking out of the dirt near the foundation. Curious, he knelt down and brushed away the dirt with trembling hands. It was a rusted knife. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at it. The blade was dull and corroded, the handle worn smooth from years of decay, but there was no mistaking it. This was the same knife the man had wielded in the house. The same knife that had taken the lives of the children. Michael recoiled, his pulse racing. He dropped the knife and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a loose brick. He had to get away from here, whatever it had happened last night. Whether it was real or something beyond explanation, he didn't want to stay any longer. The longer he lingered, the more it felt like the house wasn't truly gone, like it could reappear at any moment and drag him back into its nightmare. He turned and began walking, his legs still weak and unsteady. But with every step, the memory of the house seemed to fade, slipping further into the back of his mind like a half-remembered dream. The sun was warm on his face, and the air smelled fresh and alive, so different from the cold, musty air that had filled the house. Yet the weight of what he had witnessed remained heavy on his chest. As he reached the road where his car had broken down, his gaze lingered on the distant horizon. He could still see where the house had been in the distance. Just a faint outline of the clearing now, a ghostly reminder of the horrors that had transpired. But the house itself was gone, as though it had never existed at all. His car sat where he had left it, covered in a thin layer of rainwater from the storm the night before. Michael walked over and tried the door. It opened easily, and to his surprise, the car started on the first try. The engine purred quietly, as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. He let out a shaky breath, glancing once more in the direction of the vanished house. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he stared at the empty clearing in the distance. He had no explanation for what had happened, and maybe he never would. But as he shifted into drive and pulled away from the scene, something in the rearview mirror made his heart skip a beat. For just a split second, as the car crested a small hill, Michael thought he saw the house again. Standing there, exactly as it had been the night before. Its windows broken, its walls rotting, and its presence looming over the landscape like a dark, forgotten memory. He blinked, and the image was gone. The house had disappeared once more, leaving nothing but the empty clearing behind. Michael's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white. His breath quickened, but he forced himself to keep driving. He didn't look back again. As he drove down the winding road, the memories of the night played over and over in his mind. The sound of the children's cries, the sight of their pale, frightened faces, the man's cold, bloodshot eyes. They were still with him, haunting him like the shadows of the house itself. And he knew deep down that they always would be. The house might have disappeared, but its ghosts would never let him go.